There's a third main approach in ethical theory to thinking about what the good action would be or the right thing to do would be, that often goes by the name virtue ethics. It refers to, obviously explicitly, to the thought that we have virtues or vices that we can develop over time as kind of stable character traits, dispositions, if you want, to perform certain actions in certain circumstances. So instead of thinking in the way that the consequentialist does, just about what's going to happen if I do this and will it produce more pleasure and reduce some pain, or thinking about the principle or the incentive or the duty that I'm operating on when I perform a certain action in the way that the non-consequentialist would, so thinking about, is it coherent, is it consistent, is it sort of in accordance with the moral law? The virtue approach, which is often called the third way, thinks more about kind of living a certain kind of life over time. It's a little more diachronic in that way. Thinks about looking at people who you admire ethically and trying to do what they do in the kind of circumstances that they're in when you're in those circumstances. It's a little less about kind of figuring out with a kind of precise calculus what the consequences might be of any particular action, or trying really hard to look in respect to a particular action at exactly what the principle of your will is, and instead kind of operating with a kind of practical wisdom that comes out of a long period of training yourself in the way that an athlete would his body or her body, training your soul, training your character to have the right kind of responses in the moment that may not even require you to be reflectively considering the consequences or the principle of your will. So if you think about somebody like, Mother Teresa, someone who we think is this incredibly virtuous person, you see her walking down the street and someone is suffering horribly next to her. There's a sense in which she just operates directly from her character, which has been built up over many decades, to help the person. She doesn't have to think about the consequences or think about the principle and whether it's consistent with the categorical imperative. She just kind of operates in that way. So she's a kind of moral exemplar with this sort of practical wisdom that is the result of a long period of training. Virtue theory focuses then on the exemplars that we encounter, the kind of overarching flourishing that we go for as human beings, and stable character traits that we produce over a long period of time. And we'll see that when we're thinking about the ethics of eating, there's a certain way in which virtue theory can help us consider, decisions over time and the way in which we might build up a certain kind of character with respect to our eating. We'll also look at some challenges to virtue ethics that come from some interesting results in psychology and kind of food sociology that would suggest that we don't actually respond oftentimes in ethically problematic situations as you might think out of a stable trait or virtue of character, but rather out of sort of response to really contingent things like where the product is placed or whether we recently got a text message that made us feel good or something like that. So challenges to virtue ethics will come up as well. It's important to notice that virtue theory, this separate kind of ethical framework that we're looking at, isn't the only one that talks about virtue. So you, of course, in a Kantian non-consequentialist tradition or a consequentialist tradition, you can talk about virtues, and they will have ways of talking about virtues. So the thought is just that this one, which is typically associated with Aristotle and neo-Aristotelian philosophy in the medieval period and even in the 20th century, they prioritize thoughts about virtue rather than thinking of virtues as these things that come out of right moral action that is really sort of articulated and defined in other ways by appeal to consequences or to principles. The other thing to notice is that this word virtue, virtus in Latin, is just a translation of the Greek arete, which means excellence. So it's not some kind of mysterious thing. It's just the thought that there are certain ways of being excellent. And if you are excellent in many different ways, say the 7 virtues and avoiding the 7 deadly vices, then you achieve a kind of broad excellence of character, uniting all of these virtues in a kind of practically wise way, and thereby flourishing in the way that human beings, rational beings, can, if they perform their sort of virtuous activity in the right way for the right reason.